Hello, Terry Caliendo from Dedicated Managers here again, and up here with another update. So you can see I've done quite a bit of work since the last update, which I was talking about here. I was talking about the my goal with the project with these child entities was to be able to create, or actually this is the child entity, not children entities of other entities, which I'll talk about, but to create new entities by simply changing basically one file, the front end file, and not having to dig into a bunch of different places like the storage or a lot of other places. The goal is to be able to add a new front end entity and just have to update one file or as few places as possible. So I kind of talked about that in the last video where I showed a difference file of what it took to just add a new entity. So that's where I was, and this is where I'm starting to get to is the next thing I had to do was fix a bug in the date picker. So the date picker is this thing right here. When I click like this and pull this up, that's the date picker. And in the state of, let's see, at this area, I needed to make some changes, and it goes back to this Vue.set that I was talking about in previous videos, where properties on an object are not reactive if they're added after the fact. So if you add a property to an object in global storage, or anywhere, it's not reactive unless you give it the Vue.set. Vue can't put listeners to understand what's happening, so you have to tell it. If you fully update the object, it will get changed. But if you update a property underneath the object, and when I say fully update the object, I mean replace it with a different object, it'll update and set everything down the line as reactive. But it's not if you just set a property on an object that already exists. And again, I talked about that in another video, so hopefully I don't have to go too deeply into that. So anyway, the issue I was having was with this. I'll show it here in code. So I'm in the client view here, and this is the code for that date picker. So this is the code for what pops up here. When I click that all that pops up. This is the code there. And so there's this interaction that's going on between the local variable and the storage so this local variable is tied to storage through its get and set. So when I set it, I update the storage. That's what this update current entity does, is it updates the store, or I get the value from the store. Store. So that's how you know I'm working with the store. So this birth date local, it's actually abstracting or hiding the fact that it's working on the store. So in here, there's a lot going on. You can see birth date local shows up a bunch of times, and this menu is working with this this date picker to update that. And so the variables are being passed around, and what was happening was the date would get set by the date picker, but it wasn't updating the storage properly. It wasn't the storage wasn't reactive, and so when this thing would reach back out to get that value and pass it around for what it was doing, I'm not going to describe everything that was happening right now, but it ended up getting an old value and setting that field back to its original state. So you'd change the date and it would end up not updating. So that all came down to the fact that I wasn't calling this Vue.set. I was just down here, I was just directly updating the entity with the data keys. So when any one of these properties on the form are set, so these, let's take a step back and just say, okay, here's the form. These are the form fields, right? First name, middle name, last name, date picker, all that stuff. That's this stuff right here, right? First name. These are the form fields that come from what creates them visually. Here's their data properties, which are down in my computed properties, and that's what I talked about, tied them to the store. So whenever I set something, I call this, when a value changes, say the last name changes, it calls the setter function, and it updates it calls this object, which is update current entity by entity property container. So rather than just sending in, having a bunch of different functions to set each one, I have a generic thing that updates the knowledge of the entire form by a key value pair, which is this property object. So I send in, if I get rid of this here, I'll have a little more room. And so the last name one, I'll call this dispatch, and I'll send in the collection ID, so I know which collection I'm working on right now, or which entity type I'm working on. And that this entity type happens to be the client or the primary relative caregiver. So I need to tell it that, and then I have to send it what I'm updating. So this function takes these parameters to update, that its knowledge, and that shows up in Vuex here as this knowledge here. So as I type in here, this is calling that setter function, which I don't know if I lost my. Let's try reloading here. So we've got that, and if I type some information in, now I've got that real-time action again. So what's happening from here when this gets changed to getting here in the storage, remember this is my Vuex storage, this is my state or my storage object in the Vuex store. So that's this functionality. This thing is calling whatever thing I'm updating. If I'm updating the last name, it calls this thing and sends it the last name and the new value that happens to be in that field as I type. That's Vue doing its job, sending me this new value on the setter. So let's go to the store, and here is that mutation in the store, right? I'm looking for, let's make sure I'm right, update current entity by entity property container. That's what that is. Entity by update mutate entity. I call update entity. This is a dispatch. And so this is where I got to go back to the diff file. It'll be easier to look at. So previously I called this action. So remember there's actions and mutations. There are, whoops, I need to go to the store. There's mutations, which are for stuff that needs to happen right away. And then there's actions for any time there's anything that's going to happen that's asynchronous, which we're going to have to reach out to the Firestore and update things. So we're going to be asynchronous here. So we're actually calling the update current entity by property container, and then that's going to reach out to and commit the local mutation, and then it's going to go to the Firestore and save those changes to the Firestore as well. So getting back to this, what I was doing before was in the call to the dispatch to the action, I was updating the store right here, which actually had a couple problems. Number one, I was directly updating the current entity object, which held that data that I'm sending, which is this thing right here. There's that data on the current entity, which is the primary relative caregiver if it's in the client view. So it's updating these data objects, but I was setting it directly without going through mutation. I was doing it in an action. Remember, I'm here in the actions and setting it on the store directly. Well, that's the change. This is where it was before. So this is in the action section that I just showed. I was setting it directly, and so that was not updating the inspector when I went to do debugging. This was not getting updated when I would make this change. This change wouldn't be shown here because it wasn't reactive. So long story short, I had to, number one, pull this code out of the actions section and put it in the mutation section so that the mutation was seen by the Vuex storage and could update that debugger. And then the second thing was I can't just add a new property. So this is adding this new property, whatever the key is of what I sent in. Remember, if we go to the client, I'm sending in an object that contains these values, which I'm going to put on the object. So this would be first name here. And so if that's a new key on the object, if this is a new key on this data object, because remember, they're not all there until I start typing. Primary street address is not here until I start adding it, then it shows up. So if this gets added to this data object without using the Vue.set, if I just add it there, the Vuex component, and it's not the Vue actually even itself, this here is not reactive. So it's not, everything's not fully updating. So that is why I need to not just set it directly, but to set it as a Vue.set, which is basically in Vue.set I'm saying, hey, here's my entity that is current entity, and what I'm passing in from the parent, I'm setting in that component collection ID, which I set up here as primary relative caregiver. So wherever that is, that gets sent into here. So this is primary relative caregiver. So it's current entity primary relative caregiver dot data, which is current entity primary relative caregiver dot data, and then I added that primary street address, let's say. And so that was new. If it wasn't there before, when it first gets set, that's when I am using the shoot, I lost it. It was in here. That's where I'm using this Vue.set. So that's this right here. The dot data, the dot key is the the street address or whatever it is, first name, last name, and then this is the data that comes in on that object. The property object container, the properties object. If I get the key on it, then it gives me the value of that properties object, which is, this is the properties object. There's the key. Then this, if I access the key of the properties object, it gives me that value. So that's that value being assigned to the data object, underneath its key. And if it's already been set before, so I check to see if it's there, and if it's not, that's what this is doing with this has own property. It checks to see if it's there. If it's not, then set it as a new key. But if that key is already there, then I can just update the key. That's fine. And remember, I'm in a mutation here. I'm no longer in the actions section. I'm up in the mutation section. So when I set the that key on that object, it's already there. I'm changing it. It's already reactive, so it just takes the new value. So this time I'm just setting that entity property value container, this thing, I'm just setting it directly on the data key rather than creating a new property on the object and setting it to a value. So that allows that to be reactive, and that solved my problem with this bug that was happening where the date picker wasn't working properly due to the reactivity not being there. So I can probably actually even, let's take a look. I'll look at I think we're checked out here because that's where the head is. So if I look at this right here, if I pick a date, it works just fine and it shows up there in the birth date there. So now I'll go into the code, and before I make that fix, let's copy that commit. For some reason, Gitkraken doesn't like a detached head, so it won't let me check this out without creating a branch. So I just do it manually. I'll just go down here in my console, and I'll just do a git check out on that commit that I checked. So now my code has been reverted back to that, and the automatic updater will reload the code and automatically update the code. And now we should have that problem where, well, this has already been set, so the key is there. So this one won't have a problem because the birth date key is already there. I'm willing to bet that that'll work just fine. 2018 7/26. No, that didn't work. So again, we're back to that code that wasn't reactive. So I see what's happening here. This is that case where it's not that the property doesn't exist, it's that I am doing the mutation or the change of the variable in the wrong section. So in this update is happening. Remember, I'm changing that property. The property is there, but I'm changing it in the actions section and not in the mutation sections. And any mutations on the object need to happen in the mutation section for this debugger to get updated. So that's why this isn't getting updated when I change it, because I am changing the value. Even though the value is in the store, it actually is this value, but the debugger hasn't been updated because I didn't call a mutation. So really, you can set variables within actions. Where was I? You can set a variable. You can set a state variable within an action, and it'll work fine probably in production, I think. But in the debugger, the debugger needs it to go through a mutation in order for it to get updated here and know to look for that change. So that's why that updated, why that worked. But if we take a look at, if I load a new instance and I open up a localhost, and I get the dashboard, and let's say I add a new client, and now, oops, wrong button. I inspect. Now there is no birth date here, and if we look at the storage, so that primary relative caregiver object is set up like JDVM. It is set up. There's no data on the object yet, but if I put in these work, again, no, they don't. Sorry, because again, I'm doing that change in the action and not the mutation, which I just talked about a second ago. So that's not updating. But even worse, when I add a new property, it's not reactive in that because remember the date picker has all that circular referencing thing going on. There's just so much going on that when I set this, it doesn't even take. It just disappears. So that was super frustrating for me for a while. And I think I even got an error. The update called because it's a nothing here. It's empty. The parameter doesn't even exist, and it can't set the parameter. It's not even known when it goes to call the Firebase to save the object. So you can see what happens here. If I clear this, when I try and set it, it gets set, but then because I didn't do things right and things weren't reactive, because of all this craziness that's going on in here, just all this different calls to passing this variable around, ultimately it's just, it's not reactive and it's not working right. So that's why I get this undefined, and then I send that undefined to Firebase and I get errors. So again, the whole purpose of that was I needed to get away from what I was doing here and moving this stuff into the disk, moving this changes into the mutation section, and also if the property doesn't already exist, using that Vue.set. That's this right here, using Vue.set to set it if the property doesn't already exist. So another long one. Hopefully it was understandable. I'm losing my voice. I've been doing a bunch of videos. I'm actually going back and re-recording this one because half of it didn't record. So hopefully it's all intelligible. One other thing, if you want to get this Vue debugger, if you don't have it already, you can just search for Chrome Vue Dev. Whoops, wrong button. Well, that's it. But if you search for Chrome Vue DevTools, it's probably this one, the Chrome DevTools. And it's this dev tool. You can see I already have it added. So that's another tidbit that I use. And also, you'll see in my when I'm looking at the diff files, if your diff files don't look as clean, you might not be ignoring white space, which can cause, if I just re-indent things or stuff like that, it really makes things look ugly. So if you ignore the white space, you can really see the differences better. So Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers, 21 minutes, pretty amazing. Losing my voice. Hope you have a great day. Happy coding.